So my name is Thomas Berman that you see up there on the slide. And I'm kind of a newbie to Notre Dame. I came here a year and a half ago after being at the University of Tennessee for 25 years. And I have to tell you that I loved living in Knoxville, but I'm delighted not to have to dress up like a traffic cone on football Saturdays. And I'm really enjoying being here at the University of Notre Dame. I came here to be the director of a thing called the Medieval Institute. And I just want to give a little commercial and an invitation to you here at the beginning of my talk. A commercial, uh-oh, I got to turn this on. There we go. The Medieval Institute is the oldest interdisciplinary institute on Notre Dame's campus. I want to mention that because it's amazing how few people actually know that who were students here, and I feel like I have my job is to sell the institution. The Medieval Institute, we're now surrounded by institutes, right? We have the Kroc Institute, we have the Keough-Naughton Institute of Irish Studies, we have institutes of every different kind, but they began with the Medieval Institute way back in 1946. And the Medieval Institute is actually where graduate education began at Notre Dame as well. The first PhD degrees were given in the Medieval Institute. It was founded at the time as an institute to study especially the philosophy and theology of the forebears of Thomas Aquinas in the 12th and 13th century. And these gentlemen here are working over such texts. In the years since, it has grown enormously. And we now have medievalists working on almost every conceivable topic at the University of Notre Dame. We have, in fact, 50 faculty fellows at Notre Dame, making us probably the biggest, we have the biggest single concentration of scholars of the Middle Ages of any university in the United States, and one of the biggest concentrations in the whole world. We have 40 or so undergraduate majors and minors, including an alumna up here who graduated a few years ago. We, at any given time, have 25 or so PhD students doing advanced degrees in this area. We have 95,000 books in the Medieval Institute library, including that one right there. And I want to invite you, if you're interested, to come over and see them. We're holding an open house today till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Go to the 7th floor of Hesburgh Library. There are signs on the ground floor that will point you to the elevators. You can go right up, and you can see some of our really cool stuff, like this beautiful facsimile of the Book of Kells and many other such things. So that's my commercial, and the commercial's over with. Okay. I want to thank you all for coming to hear me talk about a topic that has been the center of my scholarly life since I was a graduate student 30 years ago, the interactions between Christianity and Islam in the long medieval period. It's a great pleasure for me to come and talk to you a little bit about that, especially in the context of the world we live in which Christian-Muslim relations have become such a stressed and difficult topic for us to think about. And yes, we all know that there's been real conflict between Christians and Muslims, actually from the beginning of the interaction between them. The map in front of you is a map that basically lays out the early conquests of the Arab Muslims in the second half of the 7th century into the beginning of the 8th century, when Islam, which began right here in Mecca and Medina, spread in less than 100 years all the way to the north end of Spain and all the way into what's now Pakistan. An amazingly rapid expansion. And it really was a set of military conquests. There's no getting around that. I want to stress some things here, though. They were military conquests. They were not forced conversions. Muslims did not convert the Christians and Jews whom they conquered. I can go into a lot of reasons why that's so, but it's in fact part of Islamic doctrine that you may not forcibly convert Christians and Jews. And they did not. And what this means is that for literally centuries, the great majority of the population in the Islamic world were actually Christians living under Muslim rule. For centuries. It probably took until 1100 or so, 300 or 400 years later, before even the majority of the population had converted to Islam. So that's one of the reasons that we have this intimate interaction, is that Christians and Muslims have been living side by side in the Islamic world from the very beginning. And then there were later kinds of violence going the other directions in the Crusade period, when people from Latin Christendom launched campaigns to go conquer the Holy Land from Muslims. These also were not conversionary wars. Crusaders were actually utterly uninterested in converting the people they came across. They were at times, though, interested in killing large numbers of them, and they did. So there's real violence here. And I want to remind you that the only sources that we have that tell us what happened when the first Crusaders got to Jerusalem and sacked the city are Christian sources in the Latin language. And the Christian sources tell us that at a minimum, the blood ran ankle deep on Temple Mount after this. It's pretty clear that the Crusaders killed every single person they found in Jerusalem. And the irony is that they didn't realize that a lot of those people were not Muslims. They were Christians and Jews who were living there and had been living there all the way through.
We have to leave. Yeah, I guess we're in the wrong room.
You're in the wrong
I
room.
want to get the aging one.
Oh, well,
We're aged.
yeah.
This
Make
is
way.
136 or we want 138.
Yeah, you want 138.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is your chance. Anybody else want to go? Yeah, I mean, the getting's good right now. Nobody will notice. Yeah, there's some.
We're going to stay here because we enjoy your speaking.
No, you. There we go. Gosh. Yeah. Man. See, that's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. So, yes, there has been violence between Christians and Muslims. But one of the main things I want to communicate to you today is that violence is by no means the only kind of interaction between Christians and Muslims in history. And in fact, it's probably not the normal one. We have a vision of history that suggests that it is, but it's not accurate. And in this talk, I want to just touch lightly on 3 points that I think everybody should know about the interactions between Christianity and Islam. Now, I have to confess that in the first hour when I did this, I never got to point 3. So I'm a little bit like that preacher, who says, I've got 3 points, and then runs out at the end. And we'll see if I get to the third, but I'll get through the first 2 at least. And the first point I want to make, in fact, is it's not the whole story that violence is what goes on between Christians and Muslims. There are a lot of other things that go on. And I want to begin that story with a very interesting ruin that still stands to this day in the modern country of Israel, in a place called Shivta. This is not a great map, and I apologize for it, but Shivta is right here. Beersheba, which is the biggest city in the south part of Israel, is up here. This is the Negev desert, really, really desert. Jerusalem is way up here in Bethlehem, so we're in this part of Israel. And Shivta was a city up on a hill that was occupied maybe between about 1000 BC and 1000 AD. Occupied mostly by Arabs, ethnic Arabs, who began as pagans. They were polytheistic Arabs. This is a map of what's left of Shivta in the way of ruins. And you can see that these Arabs became Christians, as a lot did in the late antique period, because there are three churches here: North Church, a Middle Church, a South Church. But look at this funny little thing right here. A little cupola added on the side of this church that's identified as a mosque. Let's look a little closer at that, at images of the place. So here's what's left of that big South Church. I was there about 3 years ago this time of the year. The apse down here where the altar would have been. Right over here is this, which is a what? A baptistry designed as late antique ones were for adult baptisms. And then right out over here is this. And this is what remains of the mosque that was attached right onto the wall of the church. And in fact, the mosque, when it was attached to the church, used some of the church wall to create this little cupola thing there. What's that cupola? Anybody know? That's the prayer niche. That's the niche that tells you that Mecca is that way, and when you do your prayers, you need to bow down toward Mecca in that direction. And the Israeli archaeologists tell us that the church and the mosque were both being used at the same time. That in fact, in this Arab city of Shivta, at some point after the coming of Islam, some of the people converted to Islam. Somehow they made an arrangement with one of the big churches so they could attach their prayer hall right onto the church. And when they prayed right through the baptistry of that Christian church. And that in some ways is the first point I want to make, that Christianity and Islam are joined at the hip, just as they're joined in one structure here. In all kinds of ways, though modern people in the West often feel deeply estranged from Islam, historically, we grew out of the same land, we overlapped with each other, and often we're intimately connected to each other in ways that go far beyond violence. And let me give some examples of that, ways that we're joined at the hip. We grow, of course, out of the same Middle Eastern monotheistic tradition. Everybody knows that, I think. But I want to emphasize how much it is the case that Christians and Muslims speak the same religious language, use the same kind of terminology to mean the same kind of things. This is, by the way, one of the reasons, thank you so much for staying. This is one of the reasons Christians and Muslims have always been able to argue so vociferously with each other, because they know the same language. They're like siblings, and they know how to poke at each other because they know what they're talking about. They use the same terms for stuff. So, for example, I want to stress this. This may seem shocking to some people, but I want to stress this. The word Allah is exactly equivalent to the words that Christians and Jews use to talk about the one God. It's exactly equivalent in meaning. It's actually equivalent genetically, because the word Allah is actually genetically related to Elohim. They're both Semitic languages, right? The basic Semitic root for God is ALH, or ELH. And you can see it in both of those words. In fact, there's a very peculiar thing about the Jewish version of this, the Hebrew word Elohim. What's the really funny, quirky thing about Elohim in the Hebrew Bible? Think of the other Hebrew words you know from kind of churchy language, right? Seraphim and cherubim. What is it about those words that end in im in Hebrew?
Angelic or something?
Well, the other ones are angelic. They're plural. A word ending im in Hebrew is normally a masculine plural. And in fact, the word Elohim, which is in the first line of the Hebrew Bible, when God created the heavens and the earth, is grammatically a plural. It's a plural that appears with a singular verb, Elohim bara, the gods created singular. And this demonstrates, in fact, that it's one of the many things that demonstrate that the ancient Hebrews at some point were polytheists like everyone around them. They gradually became monotheists, but they continued to use their plural form of this verb as a singular. In Arabic, it is a singular, by the way.
But that's universal rather than plural. Universal rather than plural.
I don't know the distinction you're making. It is literally a plural. Yeah. Yeah, it means a multiple of things. That's what Elohim means. Yeah. No. This is a grammatical plural. And scholars all know this. This is true. But the point is, semantically, these terms all mean the same thing. And one of the reasons we know this is that, remember, the majority of the population living in the Islamic world for centuries was actually Christian, and there were lots of Jews. And they all began to speak Arabic. They began to write Christian and Jewish theology in Arabic. They began to pray in Arabic. And when they did so, the God they prayed to was Allah. And this is, of course, still true of the parts of the Christian world that use Arabic liturgically. So if you go to a Christian church that uses Arabic as a liturgical language, they will pray to Allah. This is the term that is the term for God in the Arabic language, irrespective of what religion you're part of. It is not a sectarian term. It's just like God or Deus or Theos. They're non-sectarian terms for the one God. So they actually use the same word for God. There wasn't some sense that Islam had a different God. They used the same term for it. Okay? So a lot of terminology of a kind of a highfalutin theological kind. But there's other kinds of commonalities of religious languages as well, commonalities that go down to a much lower level, like names that Christians and Muslims have traditionally given to their children. Naming practices tell a lot about identity, about who you are. You name your children because of things you value. And it turns out that Christians and Muslims often name their children the same things. We don't recognize this because we often don't know that the Arabic word actually is identical, often etymologically, but otherwise is identical with one that we're familiar with. So very, very common to meet Muslim men named Yaqub. Yaqub. Well, Yaqub pretty clearly is just Jacob. And I mentioned to the earlier group that it seems like about one out of every 10 male students I have right now is named Jake. Well, their name, and they're usually Christians, but they're just Yaqub, right? They're just Yaqub. That's their James, in other words, is a very common Muslim name. As is Maryam. Maryam is the name for Jesus' mother in the Quran. And Maryam is an extremely common given name for women. Musa. Who's Musa in Arabic? Moses, right? Musa, a very common name. Ibrahim is just Abraham. So the common theological vocabulary on one end exemplifies the same thing that the naming practices on the other end do, and that is that there's this immense overlap in how we think of the world religiously and how we relate to the religious culture that we're part of. Okay, but it's not just common religious languages that join us at the hip. There are other things too. So I give you an image here from a medieval Arabic manuscript from about 1220, scientific work about the nature of animals. Anybody have any guesses about who this gentleman is here? What's that? Nope. No. It is this guy, Aristu. Aristotle. Aristu is the Arabic version of Aristotle. Who's Aflatun, would you guess? Plato. Have you ever noticed that we were all educated to think that Plato and Aristotle were on our team? They're our guys, right? Western civilization began with Plato and Aristotle, and they're our guys. But they're just as much part of Islamic civilization. And that happened, and it's an amazing story. That happened because, remember, those early conquests of Islam conquered the Hellenistic Middle East, the part of the Middle East that had been thoroughly Greekicized, Hellenized, after Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE. So they conquered this territory in which Greek science and philosophy had been flourishing for 7 or 8 centuries. And soon after conquering it, powerful people in the Arab Islamic world said, we got to get a hold of that stuff. The Arabic tradition had no philosophical or scientific tradition at all before the time of Muhammad. And they said, we got to get a hold of it. And so powerful people, including the caliphs, the sort of rulers of the empire, paid translators, most of whom were actually Christians, to translate especially Aristotle, but a whole bunch of other Greek scientists and philosophers into Arabic, where they were available by, say, the early 11th century, late 10th century. Now, what I want you to remember is that those works were available in Arabic before they were available even in Latin. And you think, how can that be? How can that possibly be? Well, Plato and Aristotle wrote in Greek, right? The Romans conquered the Greeks and sort of absorbed Greek culture and happily confessed that they did it. The best stuff we have mostly came from the Greeks, they would often say. But they never actually translated those great works of Aristotle and Plato and most of these other figures into the Latin language, partly because educated Romans didn't need translations. They all were raised to understand Greek, even though it wasn't their native language. So they never translated this stuff. And that meant that the civilization of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages, Latin Europe, England, France, Germany, Spain, all that territory, did not have access to these works at all, with only a few exceptions in any form that they could read, whereas the Arab Muslim world did. And eventually, when the Latin world, after about the year 1100, became suddenly very interested in regaining that material, they said, wow, and they knew somehow the Arabs had all of this stuff. And they turned to the Arabs to get it back, or to get access to it for the first time. And that meant that Aristotle and Plato were widely read by scholars, widely thought through by scientists and philosophers in the Islamic tradition, and widely built on. So that a thriving Hellenistic philosophical and scientific tradition developed in the Arab world long before it did in the Latin Christian world. And the Latin Christian world's later development of it is deeply dependent on it to start with. So yes, Aflatun and Aristotle are on their team as well. This remains the case especially in the modern Shiite tradition. A great philosophical reflection. We don't know, this is all hid from us. Nobody in the news is interested in this and lets us know about it. But there's a vital philosophical tradition that is ongoing in the Shiite Persian world to this day. Still goes back repeatedly to Plato, especially these days, for inspiration. Okay? So they're on their team as well. We have common roots, in other words, common cultural roots that are additional to common religious roots. But there are other commonalities that are in ways even more surprising and less well known than this. Christians and Muslims have often shared and delighted in exactly the same stories of pretty much exactly the same holy people. You will never have heard of this tale that's called the tale of Bildawar and Budasaf, which circulated widely in Arabic in the medieval Islamic world. But I want to tell you how it runs and connect it back to its origins and then forward to a version of it that becomes a bestseller in the Latin Christian world. The story of Bildawar and Budasaf is that there was a king in India. The location of the story is in India. And he was living at a time when this new religion was developing. And the religion is simply referred to by the Arabic word deen, which just means religion. It's never said what religion it is. But this king was very worried that his son, whom he loved, would be seduced into this religion. And so he kept his son inside the compound of his castle so he would never be exposed to this dangerous new religion. But, sons being what they are, eventually he jumped the walls, went out and saw the world, and found out, first of all, that the world is often a horrible place. He met sick people for the first time and saw people getting terribly old for the first time. Realized there's a lot of suffering in the world, and that experience of suffering in the world led him on a kind of a spiritual path that culminated in him embracing this new deen, this religion, which he did. Became a kind of a prophet of this new religion, so effective that he eventually persuaded his father to convert, and his father converted as well, abandoned his throne, and became a hermit monk. So it's a story about, and it's thinly veiled, it's about the attraction of Islam. It's a story about how a young man jumps the fence and realizes the way the world is and comes to embrace this new religion. Does that story remind you of anything? I doubt any of you have heard that specific version, but does it remind you of anything? Buddha. Yes, this is the story often told of Gautama the Buddha. And in fact, scholars have now worked out very precisely that the origin of the Bildawar and Buddhasaf story in Islam is in fact the story of the Buddha. It actually started in India, probably in the early centuries of the Common Era, moved west in various forms, was translated into different languages, eventually is translated into Arabic and turned into an Islamic tale, a thinly veiled Islamic tale. But the story doesn't end there. Because in maybe 1100 or so, some monks, probably in Palestine, but who themselves were Georgian, and I'm not talking about the people from my former border state, I'm talking about the people from the Caucasus, translated the story into Georgian, very Christian society, and they Christianized the story. The religion that was the new religion is specifically identified as Christianity. Otherwise, the story is the same, and so the boy escapes, meets the world, becomes a Christian, converts his father, who becomes a Christian, and they become known in the Christian version of the story as Barlaam and Josaphat. And so if you've ever heard of Saint Barlaam or Saint Josaphat, those terms and those saints which were widely admired in the Middle Ages began life as a Buddhist story that made its way into becoming an Islamic story, which made its way into becoming a Christian story. And after being translated into Georgian, it was translated almost immediately into Greek and Latin, and then into French and German and every other Western language, including, and this is the really cool part, including into Old Norse. Now, where did they speak Old Norse? Mostly Scandinavia, but especially in Iceland. The Norse traveled to Iceland, established Iceland in about the year 1000, and there is a saga. The Old Norse is the language that the great sagas are written in, like Njál's saga, these doer stories of brutal revenge. But there is actually a Barlaam saga, a saga about St. Barlaam. All right? So not only were Christians and Muslims able easily to exchange and read the same philosophical and scientific texts, they often loved exactly the same stories, exactly the same pious tales, which they were happy to repurpose for their own needs when necessary. So we have common cultural roots and common religious language. That's a lot of joinage at the hip, a lot of ways in which we're just like that mosque attached to the church. We're joined at the hip. Well, my second point then, is that in addition to being joined at the hip, there were centuries of amicable interactions between Christians and Muslims as well. There are these moments of real violence. But in fact, the more common state of relations was more or less amicable interaction, probably most commonly in the marketplace, all over the Mediterranean, all around it, but especially in the east, south, and far west sides, Jews and Christians and Muslims lived together in the same towns. They did not live normally in separate ghettos. There might be certain areas that were more Christian than others, but they even lived in the same houses sometimes, certainly in the same buildings. They interacted daily in the same marketplaces. They always had to interact economically because none of these groups was ever viable by itself. And moreover, there are certain kinds of trades that came to be specialties of one religion or another. In fact, I'll ask you a question. If you were living in a small enough town, a little dinky place like I grew up out in Wyoming where we have towns that actually have 3 people in them. A little small village in the Mediterranean that had Jews and Christians and Muslims living in it. What religion was the butcher? What's that? No. Who said Jew? Yes. Why? You're right.
I think it's because of the kosher, right?
Yeah. So what is it about that? Because Christians can eat any of the meat.
Right, and the Jews couldn't eat.
The Jews are bound by the laws of kashrut. What about Muslims? They have dietary restrictions as well called the halal rules. They have to eat meat that is butchered in halal forms. And it happens, and everybody knew this, that whatever is kosher for Jews is automatically halal for Muslims. Not necessarily the other way around. And so it was in fact the case that if the town was sufficiently small, the butcher was almost always Jewish because that made market sense for that to happen. So in all kinds of ways, Christians and Muslims and Jews are interacting over and over, day after day after day, throughout the Mediterranean region. Now, my kind of history is called intellectual history. I'm interested in the history of ideas and why people hold one view rather than another and how they shift over time. So I want to give some examples of this interaction that have more to do with the world of science and philosophy, but I could give many examples like this sort of economic marketplace one making the same point. But I want to move here to some examples from science and philosophy. I mentioned earlier that Arab rulers went out of their way to make sure that Greek philosophy and science made its way into Arabic. Well, then it was studied intensively in the Islamic world and in the early Middle Ages, especially in Baghdad, in what's now modern Iraq, where there were thriving groups of scholars, and in particular a group I want to say a few words about, who were called these days the Baghdad Aristotelians, a group of scholars in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th century who were zealous cultivators of Aristotle's philosophy, which they cultivated entirely in Arabic. And a point I want to make about them is that it was an ecumenical group. They wouldn't have used the term, but there were Jews and Christians and Muslims who were all part of this group. They studied with each other. They taught each other. They debated with each other. They read each other's works. One of the more celebrated members of this group, this is not a name you will know. You have to be a real geek, real kind of geeky, weird professor like me to know this, is a man named Yahya ibn Adi. Now, Yahya is one of those interesting names. Anybody know who Yahya is in the Quran? Yahya is John the Baptist in the Quran. And Yahya, therefore, is a name that both Christians and Muslims used very commonly in the Middle Ages, and Jews, by the way, who were Arabic-speaking Jews. And this Yahya is actually a Christian. He was a Christian Aristotelian in Baghdad. He was known in his day as al-Mantiqi, which means the logician, because he was a brilliant teacher of logic, of the philosophical uses of logic. He himself was, as I suggested, a student of both Muslims and Christian philosophers and theologians. And he did all kinds of interesting stuff. wrote a number of really interesting works that modern scholars are just sort of beginning to explore in the last 40 or 50 years. The one I want to mention here is one called The Reformation of Morals, which is, as you could guess, an ethical treatise about how to live the good life. And this thing became a bestseller. It's a thoroughly philosophical treatise. It calls strictly on the uses, the authority of reason to construct a model for how to live a good life, just as Aristotle would have. It doesn't say live a good life because the Bible says. It's not a theological work. It says live a good life because reason shows us that if you do the following things, you'll live a good life. So it wasn't sectarian. It wasn't specifically Christian. And it became a bestseller, including among Muslims. Very, very widely read among Muslims. And in fact, it became convenient, very clearly, to leave off the fact that the author of it was a Christian. And eventually his name gets separated from the treatise because later on it's better that we not notice that this is actually a Christian scholar whose work we're reading for advice as Muslims. Okay? So they studied with each other, they read each other's books, their books traveled across these boundaries very easily indeed. But so did their technologies. And I want to say a few words then about one of the great technological marvels of the Middle Ages, a thing called the astrolabe. Anybody tell me what an astrolabe is? What's that? It kind of includes that, yeah. Yeah, what else?
It allows ships to navigate across the ocean by using the stars.
Yeah, it is a way to do very precise calculations using the stars that could allow astrolabes to be used in navigation at sea, although they usually weren't, and there are reasons why that's so. But they could be used for all kinds of other reasons as a result. I like to think of the astrolabe, in fact, as the cell phone of the Middle Ages. And I say that because remember that the cell phone does a whole bunch of stuff, right? It's not just one thing, it's a whole bunch of things. I mean, I answer email on it, I send tweets on it, I search the web on it, I take photos with it, I listen to music on it. I mean, every once in a while, like once every 2 or 3 weeks, I actually make a phone call with the thing. And the astrolabe was similar. It was a device that did a number of different connected things remarkably well. Yes?
They had to do a lot of fake math to make it work. They did
No.
a lot of fake math.
No, they did a lot of real math to make it work.
They put the Earth at the center.
Yeah, but you can...
They did fake math on the rest of it.
Well, no, I would disagree with you there. It's real math, but you can navigate the globe perfectly well. Yeah. You can navigate the globe perfectly well using a model of the universe that actually is Earth-centered, and it is very sophisticated math that makes it work properly. Yeah. Astrolabe looks like this. This is an astrolabe from about the 1300s, now in Toronto. This one made in North Africa or Spain. An astrolabe consists mostly of a couple of things. One is a larger plate, usually made of brass, and it's called the tympanum. And then you see an overlaid plate that is like a web. And that thing is usually called the rete, or the network. And on the tympanum, underneath the upper plate, there is a map, a three-dimensional map of the heavens projected into 2 dimensions. An idea the Greeks had in late antiquity and began to put into place. And then the Arabs perfected this in amazing ways. A 3-dimensional map of the heavens. On the rete, we have all of these points. And those are points that point to the position of fixed stars. And using a third part of the astrolabe, which is, you see a tab there and a tab there. Those connect to a thing on the back, which is a sight called an Adelaide. You can hold the astrolabe by the hook at the top. and you can look at a star that you can identify, or a planet. You see Venus up there. You can use that sight on the back to find the elevation of Venus. And then you can use that information, along with tables on the back, to tell you how to rotate this plate, the upper plate, so that it shows you the map of the heavens where you are right now. So you rotate that and it shows you where you are. What that allows you to do is a whole bunch of things. You can tell what the local time is very precisely. You can navigate by it. You can use the same instrument to survey. So when Baghdad was laid out in the 8th century, they used astrolabes to survey the city of Baghdad. You can use an astrolabe to tell you how far away an army is that's marching toward you. All of this is using trigonometry to accomplish all of that.
How big is that?
They are various sizes. This one is about that big, but you'll see some that are this big. This one communicates so beautifully the way in which the astrolabe jumped across every religious and linguistic boundary, because if we look closely at it, we see that it has, by design, Arabic terminology on it, right beside Latin terminology on it. It was designed for either Latin Christian or Arab Muslim users. And this particular one is unique in that there are places where a Jewish scholar was using it and he, or she maybe, scratched in Hebrew writing onto the brass. So this is an astrolabe that went among all three communities. And perhaps the culmination, by the way, of the astrolabe technology is the following. Normally, you have to have a different tympanum for every degree of longitude. So if you move very far, east or west, you have to have a whole new tympanum put in. And so a lot of them were designed with 5 or 6 tympani that you could switch out. But eventually, in North Africa, in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, Arab astronomers invented universal astrolabes that were designed from the beginning to be able to be used anywhere on the planet. Almost none of those survive, but that's how far astrolabe technology went, and it easily crossed all of these boundaries. Now,
The southern hemisphere,
what's that?
did it work in the
No, these would you'd have to have a different projection of the southern heavens for one in the southern hemisphere. Yeah. Now, see, it's already 17 after. I'm in point 2. I'm at the end of point 2, talking about amicable interconnections. I didn't get to point 3. I'll just mention what point 3 was and ask you to dwell on it a little bit. We live in a day when people are asking the question over and over and over, what's behind the violence that seems to be directed at non-Muslims by Muslims? And I just want to say a couple things about that. And one is that there are all sorts of things going on in that violence that don't have anything to do with Islam and don't have anything to do with what Muslim authorities who are in a position to comment say constitutes Islam at all. Many of the things that groups like ISIS are doing are transparently heretical in the eyes of mainstream Muslims and are identified as such repeatedly as heretical. It has not ever been legitimate in the Islamic tradition in any legitimate form to say that it is the duty of a Muslim to kill Jews and Christians wherever he meets them. That is utterly heretical. And so there is a connection, I suppose, between people like ISIS, groups like ISIS who say they are Muslims, who are doing violence. There is a connection with Islam, but it's the same kind of connection that radical Christian groups who use violence have with mainstream Christianity. And I really think it's important in our day that we not fall into a simplistic trap of saying that because someone identifies themselves as a Muslim who is doing violent things, that is somehow representative of this tradition. And I think we certainly don't want to fall into the trap of not recognizing that Christianity and Islam have this long, long, deep, intimate connection. It's not always been comfortable. It's not always been easy, but there are piles and piles and piles of evidence that it has enormous potential for peaceability, amicability. And I just ask you to dwell on that. And I'll stop, and you can make whatever comments. You can Bronx cheer, hoot me out, whatever. But thank you for coming, and thank you for your attention. And we have about 10 minutes or so for any questions that.
Was there much intermarriage during the centuries of amicability?
Okay, so here's a good question. Was there intermarriage? The answer is yes, but it's a complicated answer. The answer is that Islamic law allowed for Muslim men to marry non-Muslim women. So it was in fact, and to have non-Muslim women as concubines. So it was in fact very common for Christian women to be married to Muslim men. It was not legal to do the reverse. A Muslim woman could not marry a Christian man. The same is true if we switch who's on top. So in medieval Spain, in the High Middle Ages, after Christian monarchs had conquered a lot of Islamic Spain, and Christians now ruled over Muslims in large numbers, it was legal for Christian men to marry Muslim women, but not the other way around. So there was always a gendered dimension to the law, and that thing had real consequences, and we can't wish them away. The real consequences of that system were that it was a pipeline for the gradual conversion of the population to Islam, because the children of a mixed marriage were always Muslims. If your mother was Christian, you were legally still a Muslim because your father was Muslim, right? So yeah, there was intermarriage, and so there was that level of deep intimacy as well going on. Yes?
Within Islam, we hear so much about the differences between Sunni and Shiite.
Yeah.
And there are lots of differences, but in your mind, what are the essential differences and why is there conflict between them?
Yeah, well,
Inside Islam?
that would take me a whole
I
a whole other lecture. But I'll just say two things about the Sunni Shiite split. This goes back to the earliest period of Islam, to the 7th century. It began fundamentally as a political split. And it was a dispute over who could be caliph, or the successor to the prophet in his political rule. And within a generation of the death of Muhammad, one group, who were called the Shiite Ali, the party of Ali, or the partisans of Ali, who was a relative of Muhammad, said the caliph should be from our family tree. And Ali himself wanted to be caliph, and he was for a while. And the partisans of his view felt that the caliph should always be in that family. The mainstream, the much bigger group that became known as the Sunni Muslims, said no, the caliph doesn't have to come from that branch. And so there was warfare over that. And then this originally political dispute then took on a religious character as well. In other words, there were developments in the Shiite tradition and in the Sunni tradition that made them move a little bit away from each other. And one of the principal ones is this, that in the Shiite tradition to this day, the real leaders of Shi'i Islam, the imams, and these days the great ayatollahs, like the Ayatollah Khamenei, have a special kind of divine power that comes to them by virtue of being an imam. They have the right and the capacity to interpret the Quran for today's needs. In a way, there's kind of a prophetic power that they have. Sunni Islam doesn't allow that power to anyone, so that the Sunni tradition, religious authority, develops just as it does in rabbinical Judaism, that the religious authorities are the people who are deeply studied in the religious tradition and who collectively, over time, come up with what is proper Sunni doctrine and what is not. And so that charismatic authority that Shiite tradition allows doesn't exist in the Sunni. And then on top of that, there are other sorts of things. But I think those are the two things I think are seminal about that. Yes.
Did Thomas Aquinas use Muslim and Jewish sources as well as Christian sources for the Summa?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Absolutely. If you get out the Summa, so the question was, did Thomas Aquinas turn to Jewish and Muslim authorities in the Summa or any of his other works? Because he wrote piles of stuff, right? And in fact, he did over and over and over. We could say it's not an exaggeration to say that Aquinas was infatuated with Arab philosophy. He was absolutely infatuated with it. And he went very far, farther than most people in his day. Remember, Aquinas was a radical in the 13th century in a lot of ways, in using Arab and Aristotelian sources to interpret Christianity. So Aquinas was busy at this project of showing that Aristotelian Greek thought and Catholic Christianity somehow fit together in a complementary way. And so he was reading tons of Aristotle. But when he read Aristotle right alongside the great commentaries of the Spanish Muslim commentator Averroes. He read them interchangeably. Averroes was so admired as the commentator on Aristotle in the 13th century in the Latin world that you didn't even have to mention his name. You just said, the commentator says, and that meant, Averroes says, that what Aristotle meant here was the following. And so if you get out almost any page of the Summa Theologiae, you'll find that he is citing Averroes, Avicenna. He's citing somebody called Rabbi Moses. Who's Rabbi Moses? Moses Maimonides, who's a Jewish Arab philosopher, over and over and over and over. And it's not just in the Summa. Aquinas, like everybody of his ilk, wrote a commentary on the basic textbook for theology in a medieval university. And this is a textbook called The Four Books of Sentences from the 12th century. And to become a doctor of theology like he was, you had to write a commentary on this thing. And if we get out Aquinas' commentary on the sentences, as it's called, we'll find that he cites Avicenna and Averroes dozens and dozens and dozens of times in a commentary on a Christian theological textbook. Think about that for a while. So yes, indeed, absolutely. Yes.
Socrates being the first of the Greek philosophers, where does he fit into the Plato and Aristotle in relation to the three Christianity, Islam?
Well, yeah. So Socrates was the teacher of Plato, right? Who was the teacher of Aristotle. Socrates, though, like Jesus, never wrote anything. So what we know about Socrates, we mostly know from what Plato said about him in his dialogues and from some other sources. So everybody knows about Socrates, including the Arab Muslims. Socrates is a name they know because he comes up a lot. But since he didn't write works himself, he's not nearly as seminal in many ways as Plato and Aristotle. Yes. Yes, sir.
Where does the development of second-class citizenship of non-Muslims come from in this context that you talked about?
Okay, this is a good question. So because what I've described for Christians and Jews in the Islamic world is a kind of second-class citizenship. And the origins are both, the short answer is it's what the Quran and Islamic tradition prescribes about it. But I think the bigger and more interesting answer is that this was a kind of a normal mode of the Mediterranean going way farther back than the time of Islam. That is, if you were part of a religious tradition that was different from us, we can find ways to accommodate you, but usually you're going to be in a second-class position. There are going to be legal liabilities that you have. The best example of this is Jews in the late Roman Empire. Christianity developed the teaching fairly early on that Jews needed to be protected in Christian society. They couldn't be forcibly converted. They had to be left alone, but nobody really had rights as we understand them in the pre-modern world, but they didn't have the same legal rights that Christians did. And so Jews living in the Christian Roman Empire were in very similar position. They're taxed differently than Christians are. There are certain things Jews can't do. And so in many ways, what Islam did is build on a tradition that was already there that actually goes back even farther than the Romans. And then the Christians just did the same thing. When Christians conquered Islamic territory from Muslims, then they put Muslims and Jews in a second-class kind of citizenship. So it's kind of a, and in some ways, it's a cultural thing, but it's also something you see throughout world history. And we don't want to admit it, do we? But we've done it, for the most part, to Native Americans. In many ways, Native American reservations function, they have separate legal traditions of their own. These days, Native Americans are mostly recognized as equal before the law, but for much of American history, they have not been. And it's true for Canada and many other places as well. So there's something in the human personality that can seize on a solution like this. And in the case of Islam, it became part of Islamic law to treat things that way. Yeah, there was a question.
What gave rise to Wahhabism?
Yeah.
My understanding is that's the most conservative. And I think there's a connection between Wahhab and the Al-Sunnis.
Yeah, so the question is another and it's a seminal question. Where did Wahhabism come from? Wahhabism is the strand of Sunni Islam that flourishes and is really the official version of Islam in Saudi Arabia. Began in, here's where I can say I'm a pre-modernist. We're beyond my area of expertise, which is true. Wahhabism is a relatively recent phenomenon from the late 18th, early 19th century mostly. It's a strand of Islam that claims to be, going back to the very basics of Islam, but like so many movements that we identify as fundamentalist are going back to a vision of the past that never really existed. And most critics of Wahhabism would say that it's a vision of Islam that never really quite existed. But it does flourish in Saudi Arabia, has great political power. And, here's where I will say something politically. Saudi Arabia is supposedly our ally, but Wahhabism is the biggest enemy of Western religion that there is in the Middle East in some fundamental ways. It's Saudi Arabia that's been building all of these schools all over the Islamic world that teach a Wahhabite version of Islam that is very, very hostile to other religious groups. And we're in this close connection with them. And it is one of the great ironies of the present that this is so. So it's a modern kind of very radically conservative.
Is there something that can be pointed to that kickstart of it?
I'm sure there is, and I just don't know the answer. We need an expert on modern Arab and Islamic politics. Maybe one more question. You people you don't want to leave. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? Yes, sir. What role does the hadith, what's called the tradition of Islam or the tradition of the Prophet, play in how the Quran is interpreted, especially in questions of the role of violence and nonviolence in religion? Well, in general, I should say that the hadith plays an enormous role in every part of Islamic life. The hadith is a big collection of the sayings and acts, mostly of the Prophet Muhammad, that are not in the Quran, which were collected very early in the Islamic tradition, written down in the 9th century. And if you read any kind of work about Islamic belief or practice or anything, you'll find the hadith cited as frequently as the Quran. And if you read Quranic commentaries, you'll see that they over and over appeal to the hadith as ways to help understand what the Quranic passages say. So the hadith plays a fundamental role in every aspect of Islamic thought, including in the law on jihad, what is legitimate jihad, what is not legitimate jihad. And by the way, if you're wondering, the law on jihad, actually, if you look at it closely, alongside what we think of as the Christian doctrine of just war, and I have had my students do this many times, they're really surprisingly similar, many, many similar elements. In other words, we can find passages in both the Christian and Jewish Bible and in the Quran that seem to advocate enormous violence. But the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition and the Islamic tradition have perfectly effective ways of explaining why this is not a command for individuals to go out and do violent things. It's not even a direction for the community. So we might say that the Hadith plays a limiting role, just as religious tradition almost always does.
You would say that
Yeah.
it makes the Quran less violent.
I wouldn't say that. I would simply say that every aspect of Islamic thought is as affected by Hadith really as the Quran is. Yeah. I think the more relevant question is, can you find it among Christians? And there are plenty of examples. Yeah, and remember that these crusaders going on crusade, they were very, very pious Catholics. And in fact, they thought that what they were doing was a holy act. So in some ways, the question is not what's in the holy text. The question is, what do people think is in the holy text? And what do people think is legitimate activity? And when you look at the long history of Christianity and Islam side by side, you'll find almost equal amounts of violence in the name of religion at extraordinary, brutal, bloody levels. So in a way, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter that it's not in the New Testament, but because it's been in the minds of Christians plenty of times.
But you can actually find it in the Quran, right?
Yeah, you can, but remember that 80% of the Christian Bible is the Jewish Bible, and it's authoritative stuff. And go get out the 149th Psalm and see what you think. Okay? All right, I've got to stop. Thank you all for coming.
May I ask a question?
Yes.